The Dark Arts of Genius, Episode 5. Hello, I'm Robert Jameson, and I'm interested in how we can make the world a better place by unlocking people's potential for intelligent thinking. These podcasts are intended to be useful to anyone who is interested in developing the thinking capabilities that are at the heart of genius. They address what, for many people, is the downright offensive subject of how some people are so much more intelligent than others. If you don't want to take the risk of being offended, then this series is not for you. This episode revolves around the subject of justice, a topic I will use to illustrate some important points about prejudice and intelligence. The first point I want to emphasize is that an issue doesn't have to be mired in complex emotions for it to attract prejudice. There are many highly questionable beliefs and practices which play a prominent and important part in our societies, but which most people rarely if ever question, often precisely because they have become so deeply ingrained within our culture that people don't stop to appreciate that there is anything particularly questionable about them. Consider the subject and concept of theft, for example. It is not the most emotive subject. It does not tend to cause great offense merely to discuss the subject. It is, however, a topic that might help us to realize the extent to which we neglect to question what we ought to question. Because they have never really stopped to thoroughly question the principles involved for themselves, people's views on theft tend to be dominated by prejudices stemming from the assumptions and accepted but rarely questioned values of our societies. Most people seem to have been brought up to believe, under the influence perhaps of their parents, their teachers, and or their religious leaders, that theft is wrong. They may accept that there are exceptions, that it may be excusable to resort to theft in extreme circumstances, such as when people steal food to avoid starvation, but, extreme circumstances aside, most people passively accept that theft is fundamentally wrong. They have never really stopped to properly consider that perhaps our society's views about theft are seriously and fundamentally flawed. This seems rather neglectful, considering that the concept of theft has such a huge influence on our everyday lives. When someone steals something, they take it away from another person who owns it or has possession of it. But doesn't the idea that theft is wrong rely rather precariously on the assumption that the owner actually deserves to possess the item in the first place? If we look at the distribution of wealth in our societies, can we seriously claim that wealth is fairly, reasonably fairly, or even remotely fairly distributed? Do the super rich really deserve to be super rich? Do the poor deserve to be poor? Such debates often boil down to arguments over how hard people worked to get their money. 9 times out of 10, the rich will attempt to justify their wealth by saying they worked hard for their money. I worked hard to get where I am, they will say. No doubt some of them did, but there is also a lot of good fortune involved, not least the fact that most rich people tend to have well-off parents, and either directly inherited considerable wealth or received other advantages, such as an education at top schools and universities, and contacts in high places, that enabled them to become rich for themselves, advantages that most people don't get. And also there is, ethically, a huge difference between people who worked hard providing useful services that benefit other people and society in general, and those who worked hard swindling people out of money through providing substandard goods and services, or by conning people into buying dodgy financial products, or by selling sugary drinks to kids, many of whom are already overweight. Looked at rationally, it ought to be admitted that wealth is not fairly distributed. And if this is the case, this casts considerable doubt over the idea that theft in general is wrong. But perhaps there's an even bigger assumption being ignored here. Our societies tend to judge the ethics of property ownership according to how that property was acquired. If you bought it or inherited it, that's deemed ethical. And if you stole it, that's deemed unethical. But why should we judge property ownership this way? It barely makes any sense at all. It is merely one possible way to judge the ethics of property ownership. It's our traditional way of doing so, but it is very difficult to justify, especially as there is what ought to be an obvious alternative method of judging property ownership that would appear to make much more sense. Oh, you earned that money, did you? You worked hard for that money, did you? Well done. But what really counts is what you're going to do with it. Are you going to spend it in a selfish way for your own benefit, or are you going to look how you can use it to benefit others? You own a large house. You worked hard to be able to purchase it, did you? Well done. But what really matters is whether you're going to put it to good use. Surely the ethics of ownership have much more to do with what you do with the money and possessions you own than with how you acquired your possessions in the first place. If you buy yourself a third supercar, then what does it matter that you worked hard in order to be able to afford it? It's still a ludicrous waste of resources that could have been put to far better use. Robin Hood was a good guy, a heroic character, albeit a fictional one, but not because of how he acquired wealth. Rather, it was perhaps in spite of how he acquired it. The important thing was that he did good things with the wealth that he stole. We instinctively understand that principle in a story, yet we are usually very reluctant to apply it, or even consider it, in real life. The trouble is that people fail to develop intelligence when they are too eager to accept and far too reluctant to question what society tells them. Let's move on to a different justice-related issue that centers on another idea that people rarely question despite the many obvious reasons why we ought to question it. The issue is that of how we should view the jury system. The jury system is frequently almost idolized as a cornerstone of our justice systems. No doubt there have been many times when juries have helped to prevent injustices that might well have occurred under an alternative system. But there must also have been many times when juries and the jury system have been complicit in perpetrating injustices. And overall, when you really stop to think about it, the jury system, largely an accident of history intended to limit the powers of kings and nobles, seems totally out of sync with what we would normally consider to be key principles of justice. For example, as a very basic and obvious starting point, normally we expect people who make important decisions about other people's lives to be held accountable for their decisions. Whether in the public sector or the private sector, in almost any organization, decision makers are generally expected to have to justify their decisions. They have to explain themselves, and other people can then scrutinize their explanations to see if their decisions are reasonable, fair, and justifiable. Jurors make incredibly important decisions about other people's lives, and they do so on behalf of us all. So why are they not held accountable for those decisions? Having 12 strangers disappear into a room and come back with a guilty verdict without ever having to explain themselves is clearly, obviously, not justice. So why do we behave as if it is? Jurors are untrained. They are often undereducated, and a considerable proportion probably have a poor grasp of the language in which the court case is being conducted. We don't even check if they have any sort of reasonable understanding of key concepts such as innocent unless proven guilty, or the idea of proof beyond reasonable doubt. If they're at all representative of the population in general, then most of them probably aren't very nice people. They're probably not very principled and not very honest. It seems farcical that we would allow such poorly qualified people to make such important decisions, but especially when there is almost no scrutiny over how those decisions are made. Perhaps you are someone who has stopped to really question the ethics of the jury system. But it is the sort of thing that many relatively educated people still fail to stop and question. And having the eagerness to stop and question what other people do not question is a major factor in the development of advanced intelligence. Would any reasonable and intelligent person, if they spent a decent amount of time thinking about it, believe that the jury system is an ethical way to dispense justice? It makes very little sense, yet we don't just put up with it, we hold it in high regard as a principled idealistic system, seemingly with complete disregard for any rational analysis of what justice should mean. The jury system is an appalling substitute for justice. So why do we accept it? Why don't we have protests on the street about the criminal unfairness of our jury system? Well, it's because our societies are dominated by convention and conformism, and hence dominated by stupidity. With so many things, if people are not strongly encouraged to question something, then they don't question it. They just unthinkingly accept what they are used to. They go along with what they are given. That, though, is the opposite of intelligence. Another thing with a subject like this, though, is that many people simply won't be much interested in the ethics of the jury system. It's one of those things that doesn't necessarily seem very exciting until you find yourself on trial, facing a life sentence, or even the death penalty, and you find that your fate rests in the hands of 12 ordinary and probably fairly dim-witted strangers with unknown ethical standards. Suddenly, then, the whole thing seems desperately exciting, or terrifying. But then you're probably not very likely to be in such a situation, are you? And so the question becomes, okay, but do you care about people who are? Do you care about people you don't know and who you're never likely to meet? Do you care about injustice? Do you care about principle? Many people don't. Perhaps they just haven't lived enough to be able to learn to care. But caring about such things is a vital part of being intelligent. If you care, you take an interest. You think about it, and you consider what you can do about it. People who do not care about other people, care about justice, care about the planet we live on, care about principles and values. Such people will never be intelligent, not unless they somehow learn how to care. That's the end of this episode. I hope you found it interesting. To find out more about my work, please visit imos.org.uk. That's imos.org.uk. And please join me again for the next episode. Thank you for listening.